Imagine standing at the edge of a vast canyon, bathed in golden sunset light, the silence broken only by the gentle rustle of sagebrush and the distant call of an eagle. Then, from around a rocky outcropping, a wild Mustang appears. But something is strange. He's not galloping away in fear. He's not maintaining a cautious distance. Instead, he walks directly toward you, his dark eyes holding something impossible to ignore, an unmistakable look of determination, of silent communication. The tourist hadn't come to these remote trails seeking anything but solitude and photographs of the untamed landscape. But when she finally understood what this horse was desperately trying to show her, her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped her camera. What was this Mustang leading her to find? What alarming truth awaited just beyond the canyon's edge? Get ready for a story of courage, compassion, and an extraordinary connection between human and horse that defies everything we thought we knew about the boundaries between our worlds. The setting sun painted the desert landscape in shades of amber and rose, creating long shadows across the winding trails of Painted Mesa National Park. Olivia Reynolds adjusted the settings on her camera, the familiar routine bringing a sense of calm after the chaos of the past year. At 42, with her dark hair now streaked with premature silver strands, she'd finally taken the solo trip she'd been promising herself for years. A way to reset, to find solid ground again after everything had fallen apart. The divorce hadn't been unexpected. Her marriage had been unraveling for years, but losing her job at the architectural firm just 2 months later had left her feeling unmoored. "Find yourself again," her sister had said, pressing the park brochure into her hand. "Remember who you were before all this." So here she was, 3 days into a week-long hiking trip, her muscles pleasantly sore from daily explorations, her mind quieter than it had been in months. The desert had a way of simplifying things, stripping away the unnecessary until only the essential remained. Olivia found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the tight knot in her chest gradually loosening. She adjusted her backpack, feeling the weight of her water bottles, trail mix and first aid kit. Always be prepared, a habit from her childhood spent with a father who'd been both a military man and avid outdoorsman. The lessons had stuck, even if many other aspects of her life had drifted from what he'd expected of her. Through her viewfinder, she framed the weathered spires of red rock against the deepening blue sky. This section of the park was less traveled, requiring permits and warnings from park rangers about staying on marked trails. The wild Mustangs roam these areas, the ranger had explained that morning, his weathered face serious beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Keep your distance. They're protected, but they're not tame." Olivia had nodded, having no intention of seeking out the horses. She preferred landscapes to wildlife photography anyway. The stillness of stone and light, rather than the unpredictability of living subjects. She was about to pack up her equipment and head back to the small cabin she'd rented when she heard it, a soft sound of hooves on stone, the quiet nicker of a horse. Olivia froze, her hand still on her camera. Slowly, she turned. At first, she only saw the dust kicked up by movement, golden in the last rays of sunlight. Then, from around a large boulder, a horse emerged. Not just any horse, a Mustang, his coat a rich chestnut with a white blaze running down his face and white stockings on his forelegs. His mane was tangled, his body lean but strong, the embodiment of wild freedom that had drawn so many to these lands for generations. Olivia's breath caught. She'd hoped to perhaps glimpse the Mustangs from afar during her stay, but this was unexpected. The horse stood roughly 30 yards away, his ears pricked forward, watching her. Following the ranger's advice, she began to slowly back away, keeping her movements smooth and non-threatening. The Mustang took a step forward. Olivia stopped, uncertain. Something about this didn't follow the patterns she'd been warned about. Wild horses avoided humans. They kept their distance. They certainly didn't approach lone hikers on remote trails. "Easy," she murmured, though she knew the horse couldn't possibly hear her from this distance. "I'm not going to bother you." The Mustang tossed his head and took another deliberate step forward, then another. There was purpose in his movement, not the casual wandering of a grazing animal, but the direct approach of one with a destination in mind. Olivia raised her camera instinctively, capturing the unusual moment. Through the zoom lens, she could see the horse's eyes clearly now, dark, intelligent, and filled with what she could only describe as urgency. A shiver ran down her spine. That had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. The horse continued his approach, stopping about 15 feet away, close enough that Olivia could hear his breathing, see the dust coating his muscled shoulders, notice the small scars that told of a life lived wild and free. He pawed at the ground once, his gaze never leaving hers. "What do you want?" Olivia whispered, lowering her camera slowly. The Mustang snorted as if in response. Then, to her complete astonishment, he turned sideways, took a few steps away, and looked back at her. He repeated the motion, moving away, then turning to look directly at her. Olivia had grown up around horses. Her aunt had owned a small stable, and summers of her youth had been spent learning to ride, to brush, to care for these animals. She recognized the behavior for what it was. The horse wanted her to follow. "That's impossible," she said aloud, the sound of her voice strange in the vast silence. Wild horses didn't lead humans anywhere. They didn't seek interaction. They certainly didn't communicate intent this clearly. The Mustang nickered again, louder this time, and took several more steps away before turning to look at her again. His impatience was almost palpable. Every logical part of Olivia's mind told her to ignore this, to turn around and head back to the safety of marked trails and ranger stations. But something deeper, something she couldn't explain, kept her rooted to the spot, watching this impossible scenario unfold. The horse repeated his pattern: walk, turn, wait. Walk, turn, wait. Each time moving farther from the trail, deeper into territory, Olivia knew she should not venture into alone, especially with sunset approaching. "I can't follow you," she told the horse, feeling slightly ridiculous for talking to a wild animal as if he could understand. "It'll be dark soon, I need to head back." But even as she said it, her feet began to move, one step, then another. The Mustang seemed to relax slightly as she approached, his tail swishing as if in approval. "This is crazy," Olivia muttered under her breath, checking her phone. No service, as expected in this remote area. She verified her GPS location and made sure her offline map was functioning. If she was going to do something this foolish, she would at least be able to find her way back. The Mustang waited until she was within 10 feet, then began to walk purposefully away from the trail, occasionally looking back to ensure she followed. Olivia kept a respectful distance, her camera forgotten around her neck as she picked her way carefully over the uneven terrain. The sun continued its descent, the shadows lengthening across the landscape. 20 minutes into this strange journey, doubt began to creep in. The temperature was dropping quickly, as it always did in the desert after sunset. She had a flashlight, water, and emergency supplies, but following a wild horse off-trail at dusk defied every safety rule she knew. Yet something about the animal's demeanor, the deliberate nature of his actions, kept her moving forward. The landscape changed subtly as they moved away from the marked trails. The terrain became rougher, dotted with juniper trees and large boulders. The Mustang navigated it with ease, occasionally stopping on higher ground to wait for Olivia to catch up. His patience seemed limitless, his purpose unwavering. As the last rays of sunlight slipped below the horizon, Olivia switched on her flashlight. The beam caught the Mustang's eyes, making them glow momentarily before he turned away, continuing his steady pace. They were heading toward a narrow passage between two high rock walls, a route Olivia would never have chosen on her own, especially not in fading light. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice tight with a mixture of anxiety and strange anticipation. The horse didn't respond, of course, but his ears flicked back at the sound of her voice. The passage opened into a small, sheltered valley, a hidden pocket in the vast landscape that one could easily miss without knowing it was there. The Mustang's pace quickened slightly as they entered the space, and Olivia had to hurry to keep up. The flashlight beam swept across the valley floor, catching glimpses of sparse vegetation and stone. Then the light caught something else, something that didn't belong to the natural landscape. Metal, reflecting the artificial light. Olivia frowned, adjusting the beam to better illuminate what lay ahead. A vehicle, or what remained of one. An old truck, its paint faded and peeling, partially hidden by the natural contours of the land and a growth of desert plants around its wheels. It looked as if it had been there for some time. Gradually, being reclaimed by the environment, the Mustang stopped near the truck, turning to look at Olivia once more. The message was clear. "This is what I wanted you to see." Olivia approached cautiously, her flashlight beam moving over the vehicle. It was an older model pickup, probably from the early 2000s, its once blue paint now a weathered gray in the harsh desert conditions. The driver's side door was partially open, stuck in that position by years of exposure. "Hello?" Olivia called out, though she had no expectation of an answer. The truck appeared long abandoned. "Is anyone here?" Silence met her question, broken only by the soft sounds of the Mustang shifting his weight behind her. Moving closer, Olivia's beam caught something on the truck's side, faded lettering that read Carson Ranch. The name meant nothing to her, but it was a clue to the vehicle's origin. What was it doing out here, so far from any road or trail? With growing unease, Olivia directed her light into the cab of the truck. The interior was weathered, dust covering every surface. On the passenger seat lay a faded baseball cap and what looked like a map, long since made illegible by exposure to the elements. Nothing immediately indicated why she'd been led here or what was so urgent about this discovery. She was about to step back when her light caught something else. A glint of metal on the floor of the truck, partially hidden beneath the pedals. Carefully, Olivia leaned in, reaching through the open door to move aside years of accumulated dust and debris. Her fingers touched cold metal, and she pulled the object into the light. A dog tag, military issue, the kind worn by service members. Despite years in the elements, the stamped information was still legible. Rivera, Miguel A., 553-87-2194. O positive Catholic Olivia's heart began to pound harder. This wasn't just an abandoned vehicle. This was potentially something much more serious. She swept her light around the interior again, this time looking with new awareness. On the dashboard, barely visible beneath the dust, was a faded photograph. Carefully, she reached for it, wiping away years of grime with her thumb. The photo showed a young man in military uniform standing beside an older woman with the same warm smile and dark eyes. They stood in front of a small ranch house, a wooden sign reading Carson Ranch visible in the background. On the back, written in faded ink, "Coming home. September 2017. Olivia swallowed hard, piecing together a story she didn't want to believe. A veteran, perhaps returning to work at this Carson Ranch. A truck broken down in a remote area far from help. No cell service, no passing travelers. In this isolated valley, she turned to look at the Mustang, who had remained nearby, watching her intently. "Is there more?" she asked softly. "Is this why you brought me here?" As if in answer, the horse turned and began walking toward the rear of the truck. Olivia followed, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Behind the vehicle, partially hidden by a large boulder, lay something she hadn't noticed before, a small collection of bones. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Years of exposure to the elements had left little but a skeleton, but the shape was unmistakably human. Beside the remains lay a weathered backpack, a canteen, and a small box that might have once been a first aid kit. "Oh my God," she whispered, taking an involuntary step back. This wasn't just an abandoned truck. This was someone's final resting place, someone who had died alone in this hidden valley, far from help or home. The Mustang moved closer to the remains, lowering his head to gently nudge at the backpack. The gesture was so deliberate, so careful, that Olivia felt tears spring to her eyes. Somehow, against all logic, this wild horse had maintained a vigil, had perhaps witnessed the death of this person, this veteran named Miguel Rivera, and for reasons Olivia couldn't begin to comprehend, had sought human help to bring attention to the site. With trembling hands, Olivia raised her camera and began to document everything. The truck, the dog tags, the remains. The park authorities would need to know, would need evidence of what she'd found here. As she worked, the Mustang remained nearby, watching with those intelligent dark eyes that now seemed to hold a profound sadness. "How long have you been coming here?" Olivia asked softly, knowing the horse couldn't answer, but feeling compelled to acknowledge his role in this discovery. "How long have you been trying to get someone to follow you?" The Mustang's ears flicked, forward at the sound of her voice, his gaze unwavering. In the beam of her flashlight, Olivia noticed something she hadn't seen before. A thin scar running along the horse's shoulder, old but visible against his chestnut coat. This horse had his own history, his own story of survival in this harsh landscape. As she finished documenting the scene, Olivia knew she needed to return to the trail, to get back to where she could contact the authorities. But the thought of leaving this place, of leaving the remains of Miguel Rivera alone again, felt wrong somehow. "I have to get help," she told the Mustang, securing her camera in her backpack. "I'll come back. I promise he won't be alone anymore." The horse watched her intently, as if understanding every word. Then, to her amazement, he turned and began walking back in the direction they had come, pausing to look back at her, once again leading the way. The journey back seemed shorter somehow, the Mustang choosing a more direct route that avoided the narrow passage they'd used earlier. By the time they reached the marked trail, the moon had risen, casting enough natural light that Olivia could switch off her flashlight to conserve battery. At the edge of the trail, the Mustang stopped. He turned to face Olivia, his silhouette powerful against the moonlit landscape. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other. Woman and horse, two different worlds briefly connected by something neither could fully explain. "Thank you," Olivia said finally. The words inadequate for what had transpired, but all she had to offer. The Mustang tossed his head once, then turned and trotted away, disappearing into the night as suddenly as he had appeared. Olivia watched until she could no longer see him, then began the long walk back to the ranger station, her mind racing with what she would say, how she would explain what she had found, and how she had found it. As she walked, one thought kept returning. A wild Mustang had sought human help to honor a fallen veteran. Somehow, against all odds, the horse had maintained a connection to a man who had died alone in that hidden valley, had perhaps been trying for years to lead someone to the site. The impossibility of it all was outweighed only by the evidence she carried in her camera. By the time the lights of the ranger station came into view, Olivia knew her life had changed irrevocably. Whatever happened next, she would never see the world or the boundary between human and animal quite the same way again. The ranger station's lights glowed like a beacon in the darkness as Olivia approached, her legs aching from the long trek back. Her watch showed just past 10 p.m., hours since she'd started what was supposed to be a simple sunset hike. Through the windows, she could see movement inside, relief washing over her at the knowledge that someone was still on duty. The door swung open before she reached it, and a tall figure stepped onto the wooden porch. Ranger Marcus Blackwood's expression shifted from concern to relief when he spotted her. "Miss Reynolds, we were just about to send out a search party," he called, hurrying down the steps to meet her. "You're well past sunset check-in. What happened?" Out there, Olivia took a deep breath, suddenly aware of how incredible her story would sound. "I found something," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Something important." Blackwood studied her face in the porch light, noting her disheveled appearance and the intensity in her eyes. "Come inside," he said finally, gesturing toward the station. "Let's talk." The ranger station was warmly lit and smelled of coffee and pine. Maps covered the walls, alongside safety warnings and wildlife information posters. A radio crackled quietly from the dispatch desk, where a younger ranger was logging reports. "Lisa, hold off on calling in that search," Blackwood said to his colleague. "Our missing hiker returned on her own." Lisa nodded, relief visible on her face as she set down the radio. Blackwood guided Olivia to a small conference room off the main area, pulling out a chair for her. "You look like you've had quite an experience," he said, pouring her a cup of hot coffee from a thermos. "Start from the beginning." Olivia wrapped her hands around the warm mug, organizing her thoughts. How to explain what had happened without sounding delusional? She decided truth was the only option, regardless of how it might be received. "I was photographing the sunset near Copper Ridge when a wild Mustang approached me," she began, watching Blackwood's expression carefully. "Not just nearby, he came directly to me, deliberately." The ranger's eyebrows rose slightly, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. "He kept gesturing for me to follow him, walking away, looking back, waiting. I know how that. He sounds, but I grew up around horses. This wasn't normal behavior, especially not for a wild Mustang." "No, it's not." Blackwood agreed cautiously. Did you follow it? Yes. I documented my GPS coordinates the whole time, she added quickly, pulling out her phone to show him the tracking app. We went about 2 miles off trail into a hidden valley between rock formations. Blackwood frowned, looking at the map on her phone. That's a remote area, restricted from regular visitors. I know, and I wouldn't normally venture off trail. But something about this felt important. Olivia paused, then decided to get to the point. The Mustang led me to an abandoned truck and human remains. Blackwood's professional demeanor shifted instantly. He sat up straighter, his full attention focused on her words. Human remains? You're certain? Yes. A skeleton, weathered by years of exposure, near a truck with Carson Ranch painted on the side. I found these with the remains. She carefully removed her camera and the dog tags, placing the latter on the table between them. The ranger picked up the tags, examining them under the light. Miguel Rivera, he read aloud, his voice now somber, military issue. There was a photo, too, in the truck. Him in uniform with an older woman standing in front of a ranch. The photo was dated September 2017. Blackwood was silent for a long moment, turning the tags over in his hand. Finally, he looked up. Ms. Reynolds, I need to ask you to show me exactly where you found this. We'll organize a team first thing in the morning. Of course, Olivia said, but there's more to this story. The Mustang, he stayed by the remains. He was the one who showed me the backpack near the body. It was almost like he was keeping watch. The ranger's expression was unreadable. The horse could have just been curious about the objects. Maybe, Olivia conceded, but he led me there intentionally, Ranger Blackwood. And he led me back to the trail afterward. She hesitated, then added, I know how this sounds. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't experienced it. Blackwood was quiet for a moment, considering her words. I've worked in these parks for nearly 20 years, Miss Reynolds. I've seen things that defy simple explanation. The connection between animals and humans can be profound. He stood up, decision made. I'm going to contact the county sheriff and our park archaeologist. We'll need to document and recover the remains properly. Olivia nodded, a weight lifting from her shoulders. He believed her, at least about the remains. The rest might strain credibility, but the evidence would speak for itself. In the meantime, Blackwood continued, I'd like you to speak with someone. Carson Ranch is about 30 miles from here. It's been in operation since the 1950s. The current owner might be able to help us understand how one of their trucks ended up where you found it. Tonight? Olivia asked, surprised. No, you need rest. First thing tomorrow. For now, I'll have Lisa drive you back to your cabin. Before she left, Olivia transferred the photos from her camera to Blackwood's computer. Each image told part of the story. The abandoned truck, the weathered interior, the scattered remains. The last photo showed the Mustang standing near the site, his pose alert, his gaze fixed directly on the camera, as if making sure Olivia documented everything properly. Blackwood studied this final image for a long time. Magnificent animal, he murmured. A classic dun Mustang, probably around 8 years old, judging by his build. He had a scar along his shoulder, Olivia added. Old but noticeable. Something flickered across the ranger's face. A scar, you say, running from his withers down toward his leg? Yes, Olivia confirmed, surprised by his specificity. Do you know this horse? Blackwood hesitated. Possibly. There's a Mustang that some of the local ranchers call the Sentinel. He's been spotted numerous times around that part of the park, always alone, never joining the other herds. There are stories. What kind of stories? Olivia prompted when he trailed off. Nothing scientific, Blackwood said with a slight smile. Just ranger folklore. Get some rest, Miss Reynolds. Tomorrow will be a long day. Sleep came fitfully that night. Olivia lay in her cabin, replaying the day's events in her mind, the Mustang's intelligent eyes, the weathered remains of Miguel Rivera, the faded photo promising a homecoming that never happened. When she did sleep, her dreams were filled with running horses and endless desert landscapes. Morning arrived with a knock on her door. Ranger Blackwood stood outside, accompanied by a man Olivia hadn't met before. Older, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of squinting into the distance. Ms. Reynolds, this is Jim Carson, Blackwood introduced, owner of Carson Ranch. The older man removed his hat, revealing silver hair cropped short in a military style. Ma'am, he said simply, his voice grave, Ranger Blackwood told me what you found. I'd like to see it if that's possible. Of course, Olivia replied, gathering her jacket. I can take you there. The morning expedition was larger than expected. Besides Blackwood and Carson, a county sheriff's deputy, a park archaeologist, and a forensic specialist from the nearest city joined them. They traveled in 2 Park Service ATVs, following Olivia's GPS coordinates from the previous night. As they approached the hidden valley, Olivia found herself scanning the landscape for any sign of the Mustang. The terrain looked different in daylight. Less mysterious but no less beautiful, the red rocks glowing warmly in the morning sun. It's just ahead, she said, pointing to the narrow passage between rock formations. The group proceeded on foot, and from there carrying equipment and speaking in hushed tones. When they rounded the final bend and the abandoned truck came into view, Jim Carson stopped abruptly, removing his hat again. That's Miguel's truck, he said quietly, confirmation of what Olivia had already suspected. Been missing for over 5 years now. The forensic team moved forward methodically, documenting everything before disturbing the scene. Olivia stood back with Carson and Blackwood, watching as they photographed and catalogued each element. He worked for you? Olivia asked softly. Carson nodded, his weathered face solemn. Miguel Rivera, best horse trainer I ever knew, came to work for us after 2 tours in Afghanistan. Said working with horses helped quiet the noise in his head. What happened to him? We never knew for sure. He went out to check on a water source for wild horses during a drought period. The Park Service had asked local ranchers to help maintain some remote water stations. Carson gestured to several large containers in the truck bed, now visible as the team worked. When he didn't come back, we searched for weeks. Search and rescue, volunteers, helicopters. Nothing. The valley is hidden from aerial view, Blackwood added, and it's miles from any regular patrol route. Carson shook his head slowly. Truck must have broken down. In this heat, without enough water. He didn't need to finish the thought. While they spoke, the forensic team had begun carefully examining the remains. The lead investigator approached them after several minutes. Preliminary assessment suggests these remains are consistent with a male in his 30s, she reported professionally. No obvious signs of trauma that would indicate foul play. The positioning suggests he was sitting with his back against the rock when he died, likely from dehydration or exposure. Carson closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the news. There's something else, the investigator continued, holding up a weathered leather wallet. Inside was a faded military ID. Miguel Rivera's face looked back at them, young, serious, with a quiet dignity in his expression. His mother passed last year, Carson said quietly, never knowing what happened to her son. She kept his room exactly as he left it, always believing he'd come home someday. The team worked methodically for the next few hours, recovering Miguel's remains with dignity and respect. Throughout the process, Olivia found herself repeatedly looking to the ridgelines surrounding the valley, hoping for a glimpse of the Mustang. Looking. "And for your guide?" Blackwood asked quietly, noticing her wandering attention. "Yes," she admitted. "It seems wrong that he's not here for this part." Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. The recovery team reported fresh hoof prints this morning around the perimeter of the valley. Your Mustang may have been watching from a distance. As the team prepared to transport the remains back to the Rangers' vehicles, Carson approached. "Olivia, Ranger Blackwood told me how you found this place," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "About the Mustang that led you here." Olivia nodded, unsure how much the older man believed of that part of the story. "Miguel had a special way with horses," Carson continued, surprising her, "especially the wild ones. He'd sit for hours just watching them, learning their patterns. There was this one Mustang he talked about often, a young dun colt that would come closer than the others, curious about what Miguel was doing." Olivia's breath caught. "Did this colt have any distinguishing marks?" "Not that I recall Miguel mentioning. He was just a youngster then." Carson looked out across the valley, his eyes distant with memory. "Miguel believed horses could sense things we couldn't, that they understood more than we gave them credit for." As they made their way back toward the ATVs, a movement on the ridge caught Olivia's attention. She stopped, shading her eyes against the sun. Standing silhouetted against the sky was a solitary figure, the unmistakable form of a Mustang, his head held high as he observed the procession below. Even at this distance, Olivia recognized him immediately. "There he is," she whispered. Carson and Blackwood turned to look, following her gaze. "The Sentinel," Blackwood murmured. For a long moment, the horse remained motionless, watching as Miguel Rivera's remains were finally recovered after years alone in the hidden valley. Then with a toss of his head, he turned and disappeared over the ridge. "He was saying goodbye," Olivia said softly, certain in her heart that it was true. Carson studied her face, then looked back to where the horse had stood. "Maybe he was," the old rancher agreed, surprising her. "And maybe, after all these years, he can finally move on." As they continued toward the vehicles, Olivia felt a profound sense that something had shifted, not just for the Mustang or for Miguel's memory, but within herself. The boundary between human and animal suddenly seemed less defined, the connection between all living things more profound than she had ever imagined. The procession returning from the hidden valley had a solemn air. Olivia rode in the lead ATV with Ranger Blackwood, while Jim Carson traveled in the second vehicle with the sheriff's deputy. The forensic team followed behind with Miguel's remains, now respectfully contained in a proper transport case. The mood was subdued but purposeful. A long missing man would finally return home, his story at last complete. As they approached the ranger station, Olivia noticed several vehicles parked outside, official-looking SUVs with government plates. Alongside, a weathered pickup truck with a military veteran's license plate frame. A small crowd had gathered on the wooden porch, their expressions solemn. Word travels fast in small communities. Blackwood explained, noticing her questioning. Look, especially when it involves one of their own. The ATVs pulled to a stop, and Olivia watched as Jim Carson climbed stiffly from his vehicle, approached the group, and spoke quietly to a middle-aged man in a pressed uniform. The county sheriff, based on the badge visible even from this distance. A ripple of reaction moved through the assembled people. Nods, bowed heads, a woman crossing herself. Miguel was well loved here, Blackwood said softly. Many veterans settle in this area. They look after their own. The sheriff approached their vehicle as Olivia and Blackwood disembarked. Ma'am, he said, extending his hand. Sheriff Daniel Ortega, I understand we have you to thank for bringing Miguel home. Olivia shook his hand, uncomfortable with the implicit praise. I just followed a horse, she said simply. If the sheriff found this statement odd, he didn't show it. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. Jim told me the basics. I'd appreciate your full statement when you're ready. Of course. Inside the station, the atmosphere was businesslike yet respectful. Olivia was guided to the same conference room from the night before, now occupied by the sheriff, a military representative, and a park service official she hadn't met yet. For the next hour, she recounted her experience in careful detail. The Mustang's approach, his deliberate leading, the discovery of the truck and remains. The officials listened without interruption, making occasional notes. Only when she described the Mustang's behavior at the remains, the gentle nudging of the backpack, the watchful stance, did she notice exchanged glances between them. And this horse, the military representative finally asked, had you seen it before yesterday? No, Olivia answered. I'd only been in the park for 3 days. But you're certain it was wild? Not a ranch horse that had wandered into the park? He was definitely a wild Mustang, she confirmed. No signs of ever having been saddled or shod. Sheriff Ortega leaned forward. Ms. Reynolds, I've lived in this county my entire life. We've had reports over the years of a particular Mustang. In that region, always alone, always keeping his distance from humans. Except what? Olivia prompted when he hesitated. Except from Miguel Rivera, the sheriff finished. Miguel used to tell stories about a young Mustang that would approach him when he was maintaining the water stations. Said the horse seemed different from the others, more curious, less fearful. The military representative, who had introduced himself as Colonel Harris from the Veterans Affairs Office, cleared his throat. Miguel's service buddies mentioned he had developed a special interest in wild horse behaviors during his recovery from PTSD. Said it gave him purpose, focusing on something outside himself. Olivia absorbed this information, pieces fitting together in her mind. So, this particular horse might have had a previous connection with Miguel. Before his disappearance? It's possible, Blackwood acknowledged. Our wildlife biologists have documented cases of wild animals recognizing specific humans over spans of years. But the unspoken question hung in the air. How had the horse known to lead Olivia, a complete stranger, to the site? And why now, after so many years? There's something else you should see, Sheriff Ortega said, sliding a file folder across the table. Inside were several photographs, old, slightly faded prints rather than digital images. They showed Miguel Rivera standing near a water tank in the desert, and in the background, partially visible, was a young Mustang watching from a distance. These were found in Miguel's room at his mother's house after she passed, the sheriff explained. They were dated about 3 months before he disappeared. Olivia studied the images carefully. The horse in the photographs was younger, his coat brighter, but the distinctive head shape and posture were unmistakable. "That's him," she confirmed, "the same Mustang that approached me." Colonel Harris exhaled slowly. "I've heard stories from service members about bonds formed with animals in war zones, dogs, cats, even horses in some regions. They say these connections run deeper than ordinary animal-human relationships. The Navajo and Hopi people in this region have traditional beliefs about animals as messengers," added the Park Service official, speaking for the first time. "Many local ranchers, even those not of indigenous heritage, have adopted some of these perspectives after generations on this land." Olivia wasn't sure what to make of these comments. She had never considered herself spiritual in any traditional sense, but her experience with the Mustang had shaken her understanding of what was possible between species. "What happens now?" she asked. "For Miguel, we'll arrange proper military honors," Colonel Harris replied. "His remains will be interred at the Veterans Cemetery in Sandstone Creek, about 40 miles from here. As his mother has passed and he has no other immediate family, the ceremony will likely be organized by his former unit members and the ranch community." Sheriff Ortega nodded. "As for the investigation, we'll close the missing persons case. The forensic team didn't find any signs of foul play, and the evidence supports what we've suspected happened. Vehicle trouble in a remote area, no communication, possibility, and ultimately death from exposure." The meeting concluded with Olivia providing contact information for any follow-up questions. As the officials filed out, Ranger Blackwood remained behind. "There's a memorial gathering planned for tomorrow evening at Carson Ranch," he said. "Informal, just people who knew Miguel sharing memories. Jim Carson specifically asked if you'd attend." Olivia hesitated. She was an outsider here, a tourist who had stumbled into a community's long-held grief. But she also felt strangely connected to Miguel Rivera through their shared experience with the Mustang. "I'd be honored," she finally said. "Good. And one more thing. Dr. Elena Vasquez, our wildlife biologist, would like to speak with you about the Mustang. She's been tracking the wild herds in this region for nearly a decade." Olivia's interest peaked. "Of course. When?" "She's actually waiting outside. She's particularly interested in your photographs." Dr. Vasquez was younger than Olivia had expected, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in, a practical ponytail, and the deep tan of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. Her handshake was firm, her manner direct. "Ranger Blackwood shared your photos with me," she said after brief introductions. "The Mustang you encountered is one we've been monitoring for years. We call him Solitario, the solitary one." They moved to a small office where Dr. Vasquez had set up a laptop. On the screen was a map of the park with colored dots indicating Mustang sightings. "The red dots represent Solitario's territory," she explained, gesturing to a pattern that covered roughly 20 square miles. "Most wild horses travel in family, groups or bachelor herds, but he's remained primarily alone since we began tracking him in 2017. Right around when Miguel disappeared," Olivia noted. Dr. Vasquez nodded. "Exactly. Before that, based on scattered reports, he was occasionally spotted with other young males. After 2017, his behavior changed." She clicked to another screen showing a timeline of sightings. "What's particularly interesting is his pattern near that hidden valley. Most wild horses would avoid an area where they'd encountered death or danger. Instead, Solitario has been repeatedly documented within a mile radius of where you found Miguel's remains. The scientist pulled up several trail camera images showing the same Mustang at different times, always solitary, often standing in a watchful pose on ridgelines overlooking the area. Like he was standing guard, Olivia murmured. Dr. Vasquez's scientific demeanor softened slightly. I wouldn't use that terminology in my research papers, but off the record, yes, that's exactly what it looked like. She clicked to another image, this one showing the Mustang approaching a hiking couple on a trail, only to turn away when they tried to take photos. This was from 2019. We have several documented instances of him approaching humans, but you're the first person he actually led anywhere. Why me? Olivia asked, the question that had been nagging at her since yesterday. The biologist shook her head. Scientifically speaking, I can't answer that. There's no evidence that horses can distinguish individual humans at the distance you described your first sighting. Unless what? Dr. Vasquez hesitated, clearly uncomfortable venturing beyond empirical evidence. Do you have any military connection? Any resemblance to Miguel? No military background, Olivia replied, and I don't think I look anything like him from the photos I've seen. What about your equipment? Anything unusual that might have caught the horse's attention? Olivia considered this. Just standard hiking gear and my camera. The camera, Dr. Vasquez repeated, something sparking in her expression. She turned to her computer, typing quickly. After a moment, she pulled up an old social media post from Carson Ranch. The photo showed Miguel Rivera standing beside a horse, a camera hanging around his neck. Miguel was an amateur photographer, documented the Mustangs extensively. Olivia leaned closer to the screen. The camera in the image was older, but similar in style to her own professional DSLR, black, with a prominent lens. It's a common camera, Dr. Vasquez acknowledged. But to a horse, a dark object of that particular shape hanging around a human's neck might be a recognizable pattern. It wasn't a scientific conclusion, but it offered a thread of explanation, something Olivia could grasp onto in trying to make sense of her experience. What will happen to him now? She asked. To Solitario? He'll continue to be protected, like all the wild Mustangs in the park. We'll monitor him, but otherwise let him live freely. Dr. Vasquez studied Olivia for a moment. Would you be willing to share your full set of photos for our research? With proper credit, of course. Of course, Olivia agreed readily. And if you see him again, the biologist smiled slightly. I'll let you know. That evening, Olivia sat on the porch of her rental cabin, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Her mind kept returning to the Mustang, to Solitario, standing on the ridge, watching as Miguel Rivera's remains were finally recovered. Had the horse understood what was happening? Had he recognized in Olivia something that signaled she might help? The scientific explanations felt insufficient for what she had experienced, yet she hesitated to embrace the more mystical interpretations offered by some of the locals. Her phone chimed with a message. It was from Jim Carson, sent to the number she'd provided earlier. Some of Miguel's friends are gathering informally at the ranch tonight. You're welcome to join if you'd like to hear more about him. Olivia didn't hesitate. 20 minutes later, she was driving down a dusty road toward Carson Ranch, guided by the GPS coordinates Jim had provided. The ranch house came into view as she rounded a bend. a sprawling single-story structure with a wide porch, light spilling from its windows into the gathering dusk. Several vehicles were already parked in the gravel drive. As Olivia stepped from her car, the sound of quiet conversation and gentle laughter drifted from the back of the house. She followed a stone path around the building to find a gathering of about 15 people seated around an outdoor fire pit, the flames casting a warm glow on faces both young and old. Jim Carson spotted her first, rising to greet her. "Ms. Reynolds, thank you for coming. Please, join us." He introduced her simply as the lady who helped bring Miguel home, which earned her grateful nods and murmured thanks from the assembled group. An older woman patted the empty chair beside her. "Come, sit. We were just sharing stories about Miguel." Olivia took the offered seat, accepting a mug of hot cider from someone across the fire. The atmosphere was one of reminiscence rather than mourning. Stories flowing naturally about a man who had clearly touched many lives in his too brief time. "He had a way with the difficult cases," one man was saying, gesturing toward the nearby corral, where several horses stood in the moonlight. "That bay mare there, she was considered dangerous before Miguel worked with her. Now my daughter rides her in competitions." Others shared similar stories: Miguel's patience with skittish colts, his ability to calm nervous riders, his quiet determination in the face of challenges. Through their words, Olivia began to form a picture of the man whose final resting place she had discovered: dedicated, compassionate, struggling with the shadows of war, but finding purpose in his connection with horses. He was particularly fascinated by the wild Mustangs, Jim Carson added, poking at the fire. Said they represented something essential about freedom and resilience. He spent hours documenting their behavior, especially that young dun colt that and kept showing up. "Solitario," Olivia said softly. Jim nodded. That's what Dr. Vasquez named him, though Miguel just called him the Curious One. Said that horse had an old soul in young eyes. A woman across the fire, introduced earlier as Miguel's former physical therapist from the VA, leaned forward. Miguel believed that horse recognized something in him. Maybe the trauma, maybe the healing. He had a theory that animals could sense emotional wounds the same way they can sense physical ones. Olivia listened intently, trying to reconcile these stories with her own experience. Did he ever mention the horse approaching him directly, leading him somewhere? Several heads shook, but an older man at the edge of the circle cleared his throat. Once, about a month before he disappeared. Miguel told me the dun colt had led him to a stranded foal from another herd. The foal had fallen into a dry wash, couldn't climb out. Miguel said the young stallion kept circling the spot, nickering, until Miguel investigated. A current of interest ran through the group. This was apparently a story not all of them had heard. Did he manage to help the foal? Olivia asked. The old man nodded. Got it back to its mother. Said afterward the dun horse just watched from a distance, then trotted off once the reunion happened. He took a sip from his mug. Miguel wondered if maybe the horse had seen him helping other horses at the ranch and somehow understood. The conversation continued as the night deepened, stars emerging in brilliant clarity above the desert landscape. Stories about Miguel flowed naturally into broader discussions of homecomings, of closure, of the mysterious connections between humans and animals. As the gathering began to disperse around midnight, Jim Carson walked Olivia to her car. Thank you again, he said simply, for following that horse when others might have turned away. "I just wish I could have found him sooner," Olivia replied, the thought that had been lingering at the edges of her mind. The rancher shook his head. "Don't carry that. Miguel's been found. He's coming home. That's what matters now." As Olivia drove back toward her cabin, the headlights cutting through the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that her unexpected detour into this community's story wasn't finished yet. Somewhere out in the desert night, a solitary Mustang roamed. A horse who had, against all odds and explanations, maintained a 5-year vigil over a fallen friend. And somehow, whether by chance or design or some connection, science couldn't yet explain. That horse had chosen her to complete his mission. Dawn broke over the desert with stripes of amber and rose stretching across the horizon. Olivia sat on the steps of her cabin, camera in hand, coffee cooling beside her as she watched the landscape transform in the morning light. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with galloping hooves and the solemn gaze of a lone Mustang. Her phone vibrated with an incoming message, Dr. Vasquez confirming their meeting at the research station later that morning. After the gathering at Carson Ranch, Olivia had reached out to the biologist with an idea, something that had crystallized during the stories shared around the fire pit. The drive to the research station took her through rolling terrain quite different from the tourist areas of the park. Here the landscape was wilder, less manicured, with wooden signs warning visitors to keep their distance from the free-roaming Mustang herds. The station itself was utilitarian, a cluster of low buildings with solar panels and research equipment. Mounted on the roofs, Dr. Vasquez waited outside, dressed in field clothes and sturdy boots, her hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat. "Thanks for agreeing to this," Olivia said as they shook hands. "Your proposal is interesting," the biologist replied, leading her inside to a room dominated by maps and monitoring equipment. Unorthodox but interesting. On the large central monitor was a satellite view of the park, dotted with colored markers indicating various Mustang herds. A single red dot moved separately from the others. "Solitario?" Olivia asked, pointing to the isolated marker. Dr. Vasquez nodded. "We placed a tracking collar on him 2 years ago during a routine health assessment of the herds. It's designed to fall off eventually, but it gives us real-time location data in the meantime." She zoomed in on the map. "He's currently about 4 miles from here, in an area we call the Eastern Basin. Has his movement pattern changed since Miguel's remains were recovered?" The biologist pulled up a comparison of tracking data. "Slightly. He's spending less time near the hidden valley, more time with the outlying members of the Copper Ridge herd." She studied Olivia curiously. "You think finding Miguel will change his behavior?" It wasn't a question, but Olivia answered anyway. "I think his purpose was fulfilled. Now he needs a new one." Dr. Vasquez didn't immediately dismiss the idea, which surprised Olivia. Instead, she pulled up more data on her computer. Behaviorally speaking, animals do exhibit goal-oriented actions. Whether those goals align with how humans interpret them is another matter. She turned to face Olivia directly. "Your proposal to document Solitario's transition back to herd life, it's compelling from a research perspective. We've never had baseline data on a solitary Mustang reintegrating after such an extended period of isolation. So I have your permission, with conditions," Dr. Vasquez said firmly. "You'll be accompanied by one of our field researchers at all times. You'll maintain proper distance from the herds, and you'll share all footage and observations with our research team." "Agreed," Olivia said immediately. "Then let's get you equipped." "And Hour later, Olivia found herself in a Park Service Jeep driven by Alex B. Gay, a young field researcher with an easy smile and encyclopedic knowledge of the park's Mustang population. They followed dirt tracks that barely qualified as roads, heading toward Solitario's last track location. "Dr. Vasquez mentioned you grew up around horses," Alex said as they bounced over the uneven terrain. "My aunt's stable," Olivia confirmed. "Nothing as magnificent as these Mustangs, though. Just lesson horses and a few show ponies. Still gives you an advantage. You can read their body language, understand their signals." He gestured toward the distant hillside, where a small group of horses grazed, barely visible through the heat shimmer. Most tourists just see pretty animals. They miss the communication happening constantly within the herd. They parked the Jeep on a rise overlooking a shallow valley. Alex checked the tracking data on his tablet. Solitario should be just beyond that northern ridge. The main Copper Ridge herd is scattered through the valley floor. Carrying only cameras and water, they hiked to a position Alex deemed appropriate for observation, close enough to document behavior, but far enough to avoid disturbing the natural interactions. Through her telephoto lens, Olivia could see approximately 20 Mustangs spread across the valley, grazing in loose family groups. "There," Alex whispered after nearly 30 minutes of waiting, pointing toward the northern ridge. A solitary figure appeared against the skyline, the unmistakable silhouette of Solitario. The Mustang stood motionless, surveying the valley. Below, his posture alert but not tense. Olivia adjusted her camera, capturing the moment. Through the powerful lens, she could see the details she'd missed in their twilight encounter. The rich, dun coloring of his coat, the darker mane and tail, the distinctive scar along his shoulder that somehow added to his dignified appearance, rather than detracting from it. "He's beautiful," she murmured. "And cautious," Alex added. "Watch how he approaches, always from downwind, always with an escape route planned." For the next hour, they observed as Solitario made his careful approach toward the herd. He didn't charge in or announce his presence dramatically. Instead, he grazed slowly at the periphery, gradually decreasing the distance while avoiding direct challenges to the dominant stallions. Olivia documented everything: the initial wariness of the herd, the curious approaches of younger horses, the subtle communication through ear positions and tail flicks. It was a masterclass in patience and non-verbal negotiation. "He's done this before," she observed, noting the deliberate nature of his movements. Alex nodded. "Mustangs have complex social structures, but they're adaptable." Solitario was part of a herd before he became solitary. He remembers the protocols. By mid-afternoon, something remarkable had happened. Solitario was grazing peacefully alongside several mares and younger horses at the edge of the main herd, not fully integrated, but tolerated, accepted at the periphery. "It's a start," Alex commented as they packed up their equipment. "Reintegration usually takes weeks, sometimes months, but he's laying the groundwork." Olivia reviewed the images on her camera's display screen, a thought forming that she hesitated to share. Finally, as they hiked back toward the Jeep, she gave voice to it. "Do you think he knows that Miguel has been found, I mean?" Alex was quiet for several steps. When he finally answered, his voice was thoughtful. "My grandfather was Navajo. He would say animals understand things beyond human comprehension, that they exist partially in this world and partially in another." He adjusted his pack before continuing. "Scientifically speaking, Solitario likely detected changes at the site. The disturbance of the ground, new human scents, the removal of what had been a constant presence. Whether he connects that to completion of a purpose, Alex shrugged. Science doesn't give us language for that yet. The sun was beginning its descent as they returned to the research station. Dr. Vasquez reviewed Olivia's footage with professional interest, making notes on behavior patterns and herd dynamics. "This is excellent documentation," she said finally. "Would you be interested in continuing tomorrow? The first 72 hours of reintegration attempts are particularly valuable data points." Olivia agreed immediately. What had begun as a strange encounter with a solitary Mustang was evolving into something more, a chapter in a larger story about connection, purpose, and the invisible threads that bind living creatures together across the boundaries of species and understanding. As she drove back to her cabin that evening, Olivia's original travel plan seemed distant and unimportant. The architectural projects waiting at home, the job interviews scheduled for the following week, none of it held the urgency of documenting Solitario's journey. For reasons she couldn't fully articulate, witnessing his transition felt like completing a circle that had begun when he'd first approached her on the trail. Her phone rang as she pulled up to the cabin. Jim Carson calling with news about Miguel's memorial service, scheduled for 2 days hence at the Veterans Cemetery. "There'll be military honors," he explained, "and afterward a gathering at the ranch. We'd be honored if you'd attend." "Of course," Olivia replied. "I wouldn't miss it." As she ended the call, the pieces of her next few days fell into place, continuing to document Solitario's reintegration, attending Miguel's service, perhaps even beginning to shape these experiences into something more permanent than memory. For the first time since arriving in this landscape of red rock and resilient life, Olivia felt a sense of purpose that had eluded her for months. Through the unexpected connection with a lone Mustang and a community's long-held grief, she had stumbled into a story that demanded to be witnessed and shared. The next morning arrived with clouds gathering on the horizon, promising rare desert rain. Olivia met Alex at the research station before dawn, both eager to document Solitario's second day of reintegration attempts. They carried additional equipment this time, a blind for better concealment, recording devices to capture the sounds of the herd, and provisions for a full day in the field. "Dr. Vasquez wants us to try a different observation point today," Alex explained, spreading a topographical map across the hood of the Jeep. "The herd typically moves toward these water sources after a rainfall. We might catch more interaction. Dynamics there. They set up in a natural depression overlooking a shallow arroyo that would likely channel water if the promised rain materialized." Through binoculars, Olivia could see the main herd grazing about half a mile away. Solitario was visible at the periphery, maintaining the careful distance established the previous day. "He's still testing boundaries," Alex observed. "Watch how he mirrors the movements of the dominant stallion." Olivia nodded, documenting the subtle dance through her telephoto lens. The lead stallion, a powerful black horse Alex identified as Thunder, kept a watchful eye on Solitario, occasionally displaying warning behaviors when the newcomer drifted too close to his preferred mares. "It's like watching the most nuanced negotiation," Olivia murmured, capturing a sequence of Thunder approaching Solitario with ears pinned back. Then Solitario immediately lowering his head and stepping aside, acknowledging the hierarchy without challenging it. "That's exactly what it is," Alex agreed. A negotiation for acceptance. Solitario is essentially saying, I'm not a threat, while Thunder establishes his continued dominance. By mid-morning, the first drops of rain began to fall. The herd's behavior shifted almost immediately. Horses raising their heads to taste the moisture in the air. Younger animals becoming playful in the cooling temperature. As Alex had predicted, they began moving toward the natural water collection points, including the arroyo near the observation blind. Stay very still now, Alex whispered as the herd approached within 100 yards. They'll likely pause to drink, then continue moving through. Thunder led the procession, followed by his preferred mares and their foals. Subordinate stallions and other members flowed behind like a living river of muscle and movement. Solitario hung back, watching the process carefully before following. At a respectful distance, what happened next occurred so quickly that Olivia nearly missed it through her viewfinder. A young foal, excited by the rain and fresh water, bolted away from its mother, slipped on the muddy edge of the arroyo, and tumbled into the depression. The water was shallow but flowing steadily now, and the foal struggled to find footing on the slick surface. The mother nickered anxiously, pacing the edge, but hesitating to navigate the steep bank. Thunder and the other adults grew alert to the disturbance, but remained focused on guarding the herd from potential threats. Then Solitario moved. Without hesitation, he picked his way carefully down the arroyo bank, approaching the struggling foal. The young horse initially shied away, but Solitario simply stood steady, creating a block against the flowing water, allowing the foal to orient itself and find stable footing. He's creating a safe space, Alex whispered, his scientific detachment momentarily forgotten. Look how he's positioned himself. Indeed, Solitario had placed his body between the flowing water and the foal, standing firm as the young horse found its balance and scrambled back up the bank to its relieved mother. Instead of immediately following, Solitario remained in the arroyo for several moments, watching the reunion before climbing up to Solid, aground. When he emerged, something subtle had shifted in the herd's response to him. The mother of the foal approached, touching noses briefly in what appeared to be acknowledgement. Thunder, while still maintaining his dominant position, displayed less aggressive posturing. That, Alex said softly, is how you earn your place in a herd. Olivia continued photographing as Solitario was allowed to approach the main drinking area, still at the periphery, but noticeably closer than before. The integration was happening faster than either of them had anticipated, accelerated by a simple act of assistance that demonstrated Solitario's value to the collective. It reminds me of Miguel's story, Olivia said, as they packed up their equipment. Several hours later, the rain having passed to leave a freshly washed landscape behind. The old man at the ranch said Solitario once led Miguel to a stranded foal. Alex nodded thoughtfully. There's a pattern there, helping those who are vulnerable. He secured the blind in its carrying case before adding, my grandfather would say, Solitario carries the spirit of a protector. That evening, when they returned to the research station, Dr. Vasquez reviewed their footage with growing excitement. This is remarkable documentation, she said, replaying the rescue sequence. Most reintegration processes take much longer, especially for a stallion that's been solitary for years. Maybe he was never truly solitary, Olivia suggested. Physically separate from the herd, yes, but still connected to something greater through his vigil over Miguel. Instead of dismissing this less scientific interpretation, Dr. Vasquez considered it thoughtfully. Animals operate on levels we're only beginning to understand. Their concept of community, of purpose, might be fundamentally different from ours, yet no less real. That night, in her cabin, Olivia began organizing her growing collection of photographs, not just of Solitario, but of the landscape, the community at Carson Ranch, the memorial preparations for Miguel. A narrative was emerging that transcended her initial encounter, connecting strands of loss, loyalty, and belonging that resonated deeply with her own unsettled state. The military memorial service for Miguel Rivera was held the following morning, under clear blue skies at Sandstone Creek Veterans Cemetery. Olivia arrived to find a larger gathering than she had expected. Veterans in pressed uniforms, ranch hands in their Sunday best, community members bearing flowers and flags. Colonel Harris led the proceedings with dignified precision. A rifle squad fired a 3-volley salute that echoed across the desert landscape. 2 soldiers performed the ceremonial triangle folding of the American flag, which was then presented to Jim Carson in lieu of family. On behalf of a grateful nation, Colonel Harris said, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. Olivia stood somewhat apart, documenting the ceremony with quiet respect, her camera capturing the solemn faces, the military precision, the weathered hands accepting the folded flag. Through her lens, she noticed details others might miss. A young veteran with prosthetic legs wiping away tears, an elderly woman clutching a faded photograph, ranch hands removing their hats in synchronized respect as the casket was lowered. As the formal ceremony concluded, Jim Carson approached her. "Would you join us at the front? You're part of this story, too." Surprised, Olivia allowed herself to be guided forward. Several of Miguel's former service members nodded in acknowledgement as she joined the inner circle. Miguel believed that no one is ever truly lost if they're remembered, Jim said to the gathered mourners. For 5 years, we carried his memory while searching for answers. And in the end, those answers came through an unexpected messenger. He glanced at Olivia. Ms. Reynolds followed where few would have gone, trusted what few would have believed, and brought our friend home. After the ceremony, the gathering transitioned to Carson Ranch, where tables had been set up under a large cottonwood tree. Food was plentiful, stories flowed freely, and photographs of Miguel throughout his life were displayed on boards near the house. Olivia moved through the gathering, listening more than speaking, absorbing the fuller picture of the man whose recovery had brought her into this community. A weathered veteran with a Marine Corps cap approached her as she examined the photo. Displays. "I served with Miguel in Afghanistan," he said without preamble. "He was the guy you wanted beside you when things went sideways. Never panicked, never left anyone behind." That seems to be the common thread in everyone's stories, Olivia observed. His loyalty, the veteran nodded. Some qualities transcend environments. Miguel was the same in the desert with bullets flying as he was here with horses needing gentling. Steady, patient, present. He studied her for a moment. Kind of like that Mustang of his. Solitario wasn't really his, though, Olivia pointed out. He was wild. "Belonging isn't always about ownership," the man replied with a slight smile. "Sometimes it's about recognition. Miguel recognized something in that horse, just like the horse recognized something in him." He tipped his cap slightly. "And apparently, in you too." As the afternoon progressed, Jim Carson found Olivia again, this time carrying a weathered leather journal. Miguel's mother kept this after he disappeared. I think he would want you to see it. Olivia accepted the journal with careful hands, feeling the weight of its significance. The leather cover was worn smooth at the edges, the pages slightly swollen from desert humidity and time. She looked questioningly at Jim. "Go ahead," he encouraged. "There's something in there I think you'll find interesting." Finding a quiet spot on the ranch's porch swing, Olivia gently opened the journal. Inside were Miguel's neat, precise handwriting and sketches documenting his observations of the wild Mustangs. The early entries were primarily technical: herd movements, water sources, behavioral patterns, written with the methodical attention of someone trained to notice details. As she turned the pages, however, the entries became more personal. Miguel began referring to specific horses by names he'd given them, noting their distinct personalities and habits. And increasingly, one horse appeared more than others. A young dun colt Miguel had named Sentinella, Sentinel. April 12, 2017. Sentinella approached the water station again today, third time this week. Unlike the others, he watches me work. Instead of keeping his distance, there's something different about this one. An awareness in his eyes that reminds me of the service dogs at the VA. That same focused intelligence. May 28, 2017. Found Sentinella waiting near the Eastern Ridge. Water station this morning. He stood perfectly still while I refilled the tanks, never more than 20 yards away. Martinez would say I'm anthropomorphizing, but I swear this horse recognizes me specifically now, not just as a human, but as me. Olivia paused at an entry from mid-June, accompanied by a detailed sketch of a young Mustang that was unmistakably Solitario. June 16, 2017. Something extraordinary happened today. Sentinella approached while I was checking the North Ridge, but instead of his usual curious observation, he seemed agitated. He kept walking away, looking back, clearly wanting me to follow. Against all protocol, I did. He led me nearly half a mile to a drainage ditch where a foal from the main herd had become trapped. Without Sentinella's intervention, I never would have found it. The mare was nearby, distressed but unable to help her foal. After I helped the foal out, Sentinella simply watched from a distance, then left once the little one reunited with its mother. Dr. Vasquez would have a scientific explanation, I'm sure. But out here, watching this wild horse deliberately seek human assistance for a specific purpose, it makes me question the boundaries we assume exist between our worlds. The final entry was dated just 3 days before Miguel's disappearance. September 2017. Heading out tomorrow to check the remote water stations before the dry season intensifies. Taking extra supplies since the truck's been running rough. Sentinella has been scarce lately. Spotted him only once this week, watching from the Western Ridge. The ranch hands think I'm crazy for talking about him like he's something special. Maybe I am. But after what I've seen in war and what I've experienced in recovery, I've learned to recognize fellow old souls when I meet them. Some connections don't need scientific explanation. Olivia closed the journal slowly, a wave of emotion washing over her. Miguel had recognized in Solitario the same intelligence, the same deliberate communication that she had experienced. The horse hadn't just randomly approached her. He had a history of seeking human intervention when needed. Jim settled onto the porch swing beside her. Found the Sentinella entries I see. He was connecting with Solitario years ago, the same way. Olivia trailed off, still processing the implications. the same way you did," Jim finished for her. Miguel had a theory about that horse. Said he had an unusual capacity for what Miguel called bridging, crossing the usual boundaries between wild and human worlds. Did anyone believe him? Jim chuckled softly. Some did, some didn't. Those of us who've spent decades with horses and learn there are some things you can't explain away with conventional thinking. He gestured to the distant hills. Out here, the lines between what we understand and what we don't get pretty blurry sometimes. As the memorial gathering began to disperse, Dr. Vasquez arrived, joining them on the porch. "I thought you'd want to know," she said without preamble. "We've been tracking Solitario through the day. He's fully integrated with the main herd now." "Already?" Jim asked, surprised. "That's unusually fast." Dr. Vasquez nodded. The incident with the foal yesterday accelerated his acceptance. He's currently traveling with the northeastern section of the herd, maintaining a respectful distance from Thunder, but no longer isolated at the periphery. Olivia felt a strange mixture of joy and loss at this news. Solitario's reintegration was a positive development, yet it also represented the closing of the unusual connection that had brought her into this story. "We'll continue monitoring him, of course," Dr. Vasquez continued. "But I wanted to let you know that your documentation of his transition has already proven incredibly valuable. We've never had such comprehensive footage of a solitary Mustang's reintegration process." As twilight settled over the ranch, Olivia found herself standing at the corral fence, looking out toward the distant hills where Solitario now roamed with his herd. The completion of Miguel's story and the beginning of a new chapter for the Mustang felt right, a natural conclusion to the strange intersection of their paths. "Thinking about heading back soon?" Jim's voice came from behind her. Olivia turned, realizing she hadn't actually considered her departure. Her week-long stay had stretched to nearly 10 days, her original plans forgotten in the wake of everything that had happened. "I suppose I should," she admitted. "I have job interviews waiting, decisions to make." Jim leaned against the fence beside her. "You know, Miguel's position at the ranch was never filled after he disappeared. We need someone to maintain the water stations, document the herds, work with the Park Service on conservation efforts." Olivia looked at him in surprise. "Are you offering me a job?" "Just putting the possibility out there," Jim said with a slight smile. "Someone with your photography skills, your connection to this particular story, might be valuable to our ongoing work." "I don't have Miguel's experience with horses," she pointed out. "You have enough," Jim countered. "And more importantly, you have the right perspective. You understand that there's more to these animals than just biological specimens or pretty scenery." Olivia gazed back toward the hills, considering. Her life in the city had been unraveling before this trip. The divorce, the job loss, the sense of disconnection. Here, almost accidentally, she had found purpose, community, and a story that resonated deeply with her own need for direction. "Let me think about it," she said finally. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Olivia had arranged to meet Alex for one final documentation session, hoping to capture Solitario in his new role within the herd. They set out early, heading to a different observation point based on the tracking data from the previous evening. "The herd is moving through the eastern valley today," Alex explained as they hiked toward a sheltered overlook. "It's part of their regular rotation, following the freshest grazing areas after the rain. Setting up their equipment with practiced efficiency, They settled in to wait. Within an hour, the first members of the herd appeared in the valley below. Mares and foals first, followed by younger stallions, and eventually Thunder, maintaining his position of authority with proud head carriage. "There," Alex whispered, pointing toward the northwestern approach. Solitario appeared with several other mature horses, moving comfortably within their loose formation. Though still somewhat separate, he was unmistakably part of the group now, accepted into the complex social structure of the herd. Olivia captured the sequence through her telephoto lens, noting the relaxed posture and confident movement that contrasted with his earlier cautious approaches. "He's found his place," she murmured. "That's the remarkable thing about herd dynamics," Alex replied. "Once acceptance occurs, integration can happen quite rapidly. The hierarchy reorganizes to accommodate new members." As they watched, something unexpected happened. Solitario separated slightly from his immediate group, moving to higher ground on a nearby ridge. For several minutes, he stood alert, surveying the valley and the lands beyond, a sentinel watching over the safety of the herd. "That's the behavior that earned him his name," Alex explained. "Dr. Vasquez first documented it years ago. Most herd members focus on grazing or social interactions, but Solitario regularly takes these sentinel positions." Through her lens, Olivia captured the powerful image of the Mustang standing watchful on the ridge, his posture alert yet relaxed, embodying both belonging and purpose. In that moment, the connections crystallized in her mind. Miguel finding purpose through his work with the horses after war, Solitario maintaining his vigil over Miguel, and then finding his place in the herd, and her own unexpected journey. From aimless tourist to documenter of this remarkable story. "I think I've made a decision," she said, lowering her camera. "About the job offer?" Alex asked, surprising her with his awareness. "Jim mentioned it to you?" Alex smiled. "Small community. News travels fast." "I'm going to accept," Olivia said, the certainty settling comfortably within her. "At least for a year. Document the herds. Help maintain the water stations. Maybe create a proper photo archive of the Mustang's behaviors and social structures. Including Solitario. Especially Solitario." She raised her camera again, focusing on the distant figure of the Mustang as he rejoined the herd. His story deserves to be told. The sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating the valley in golden light. Below them, the herd moved as one fluid entity, individual horses functioning as part of a greater whole. Solitario moved among them now, his solitary vigil complete, his new purpose found within the community he had rejoined. As Olivia captured these final images, she felt a sense of completion, not just for Solitario's journey or Miguel's story, but for her own unexpected detour that had become a new direction. Sometimes, she reflected, the most profound connections come from the most unlikely messengers. And sometimes, finding your way home requires first being brave enough to follow where you're led, even when the path makes no logical sense. In the distance, Solitario raised his head, the sun catching his profile in perfect light. Olivia captured the moment, a final photograph to bridge the end of one story and the beginning of another. As autumn settled over the desert landscape, Olivia found herself firmly established in her new role at Carson Ranch. She had converted one of the unused outbuildings into a combination office and studio. its walls now covered with maps tracking the Mustang herds and enlarged photographs documenting their behaviors. Miguel's journal occupied a special place on her desk, a reminder of the unusual thread that had drawn her into this new life. 3 months had passed since she'd accepted Jim's offer, postponing her return to city life indefinitely. Her divorce was finalized through emails and courier-delivered documents, a distant epilogue to a chapter already closed in her mind. The architectural firms that had once represented her future career path received polite messages declining their interview offers. Instead, Olivia found herself rising before dawn most days, checking water stations throughout the park, documenting the seasonal movements of the wild herds, and gradually earning the trust of both the ranch community and the park research team. Her photographs of Solitario's reintegration had been featured in a regional conservation magazine, bringing attention to the park's Mustang preservation efforts. "You've got visitors," Jim called one crisp October morning as Olivia returned from checking the eastern stations. She followed his gesture toward the main house, where a familiar Park Service vehicle was parked. Dr. Vasquez and Alex waited on the porch, a tablet computer and folder of documents between them. Their expressions held a mixture of excitement and professional reserve that immediately piqued Olivia's curiosity. "We've been analyzing the data from Solitario's tracking collar," Dr. Vasquez began after brief greetings. "There's something I think you'll find interesting." She opened the tablet to display a map overlaid with movement patterns. "We've compiled 6 years of tracking data, 3 years before Miguel's disappearance, 3 years after. The patterns are remarkably consistent in one respect." She highlighted a series of points on the map. "These locations represent consistent deviations from normal herd patterns." Olivia studied the map, recognition dawning. "Those are the water stations." "Precisely," Alex confirmed, "but not just any water stations, specifically the ones Miguel established and maintained. Solitario has been regularly visiting these locations for years, even when they're not on the herd's optimal path. It's as if he's checking them," Dr. Vasquez added, her scientific caution momentarily yielding to the compelling nature of the data. "Maintaining a route that he established during Miguel's time here." Olivia felt a shiver of understanding. "He's continuing Miguel's work." "That would be an anthropomorphic interpretation," Dr. Vasquez said automatically, but without conviction. "Scientifically, we would say he's displaying learned movement patterns associated with positive reinforcement experiences." "But you don't believe that's all it is," Olivia observed. The biologist hesitated, then sighed. "Off the record, the data suggests a level of purpose that challenges our conventional understanding of equine cognition." Alex was less reserved. "He's keeping Miguel's route alive. Science can call it whatever it wants, but anyone who understands horses can see what's happening." Dr. Vasquez opened the folder she'd brought, revealing a formal document with the Park Service letterhead. "Which brings us to our proposal. We'd like to establish these water stations as permanent fixtures, maintained through a joint program between the Park Service and Carson Ranch. The Miguel Rivera Mustang Conservation Initiative." Jim, who had joined them on the porch, nodded his approval. "Miguel would have liked that." "We'd like you to be the official documentary photographer," Alex added, turning to Olivia. "Creating a visual record of the project, particularly focusing on how the herds interact with these human-established resources while maintaining their wild nature." Olivia didn't hesitate. "I'd be honored. The following week brought the first winter storm, dusting the desert with a rare coating of snow that transformed the landscape into something almost magical. Olivia set out at dawn, driving to the highest observation point to capture the herds in this transformed environment. Through her telephoto lens, she watched as the main Copper Ridge herd navigated the snow-covered terrain, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Solitario moved confidently among them now, his position in the hierarchy established somewhere between the dominant stallions and the younger males, a respected elder with his own unique role. As Olivia observed, Solitario once again took up his sentinel position on a ridge overlooking the herd. But this time, he turned toward her observation point, his gaze seeming to fix directly on her location, despite the considerable distance between them. For a long moment, horse and human regarded each other across the snowy expanse. Then Solitario tossed his head and rejoined the herd, disappearing into the whiteness like a legend returning to myth. That evening, as Olivia reviewed her photographs in the warm glow of her studio, she found the perfect image to complete the story she'd been documenting. Solitario on the snow-covered ridge, looking directly toward the camera, his wild dignity framed against the winter sky. Behind him, barely visible in the distance, was the marker for one of Miguel's water stations. She titled the image "The Sentinel's Watch" and added it to the growing collection that would eventually become an exhibition at the regional museum. Messengers, the untold communication between species. 6 months after her unexpected encounter with Solitario on that sunset trail, Olivia stood before a small gathering at the official dedication of the Miguel Rivera Mustang Conservation Initiative. Rangers, veterans, ranch hands, and conservation officials listened as she shared the story that had brought them all together. A wild Mustang seeking human help, a fallen veteran finally brought home, and the unexpected connections that had transformed her understanding of communication across the boundaries of species. Miguel wrote in his journal that he recognized in Centinela, in Solitario, what he called an old soul, Olivia concluded, gesturing toward the photograph of the Mustang that now hung prominently in the visitor center. He believed that some connections transcend our normal understanding, that sometimes messages come to us through unexpected messengers. She paused, looking out at the faces before her. People whose lives had been touched by this unusual story in different ways. Science can explain some aspects of what happened, how Solitario might have associated humans with help based on past experience, how he recognized patterns and sought assistance when his normal resources failed. But science alone can't capture the full meaning of this story. Jim Carson nodded from the front row, Miguel's folded flag visible in his weathered hands. The truth is simpler and more profound, Olivia continued. A wild horse maintained a 5-year vigil over a fallen friend. He sought help when he couldn't complete his watch alone, and in doing so, he brought healing to a community and purpose to those who were lost in their own ways. She gestured toward the windows, where the distant hills were visible under the clear blue sky. Solitario runs with his herd now, his solitary watch complete. Miguel has come home to rest among his brothers and sisters in arms. And all of us who were touched by their story have been reminded of something essential, that the connections between living beings are deeper and more mysterious than we often remember. As the ceremony concluded and people moved toward the reception area, Olivia stepped outside, looking toward the hills, where she knew the Mustangs roamed freely. Somewhere out there, Solitario continued his quiet route between herd life and the water stations that remained his connection to a human who had recognized something special in him years ago. Some stories defied conventional explanation. Some connections transcended the boundaries we create between species. And sometimes, the most profound messages came through the most unexpected messengers. If this story touched your heart, remember that there are countless connections waiting to be discovered in the world around us. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge our understanding of the bonds between humans and animals. Leave a like if you believe, as Miguel did, that some souls recognize each other across all boundaries. And share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that healing and purpose can come from the most unexpected sources.